In 1965, on the eve of China's Cultural Revolution, an 80th birthday party was held in Shanghai for an American woman. Although she was an obscure figure to many Americans, she was one of China's most respected foreign heroines. Her name was Anna Louise Strong, and by birth she should have been celebrating with the daughters of the American Revolution, not the fathers of the Chinese Communist Revolution.
When we were there, we used to go for walks with her very often before dinner on Sunday. If the weather was nice, we would go to a park, and children would refer to her as the American lady, Chairman Mao's friend, the lady of the paper tiger interview. She was very, very well known. Whenever she appeared in the street, she was recognized.
What journey had brought her from her birthplace in America's Midwest to this place of honor in the Far East? Who was Anna Louise Strong, and how had she come to so completely change worlds? Anna Louise Strong was a paradox, a minister's daughter who advocated revolution, a communist spokesperson who made money on real estate, a career woman who would write longingly of marriage, a temperamental egotist who devoted her life to others. Anna Louise Strong was a writer who covered the major revolutions of the 20th century. Her mission would begin among the shipyard workers of Seattle and end among the Red Guards of China. Her journey would take her to Russia to participate in the building of a revolutionary society and to teach English to Trotsky, to Spain to record the struggle against fascism, and to China, where she shared life in the Yan'an caves with Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, and where, in an interview with her, Mao first described America's imperialist power as a paper tiger. She would remain a controversial figure, deported by the Russians as an American spy in 1949 and hounded by the FBI as a communist courier. She wrote over 30 books, including 2 bestsellers and hundreds of articles. And what she wrote and did inspired some and infuriated others.
Anna Louise was a real natural-born romantic in the best sense of the word and the sentimental sense of the word. I think that her interest in the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution or the Spanish Civil War, whatever it was that she was writing about, was part of that romantic interest.
As I interpret the term journalist, it would include critical thinking about what you were doing and covering all features that one might cover. And I think she concentrated on what I would call the jolly side of revolution, the upbeat, the children, the improved masses and so on, without looking at the rest of it. Or if she looked at it, not reflecting it in her writing.
Anna Louise was in search of a better way of doing things for the human race. She was in search of a setup where things were done for good, not for private profit, where wealth and influence could not control politics.
The class struggle to her was just a journey that she was going along as a tourist, and she could disembark at any time and go back home, and it was not her life as it was with the rest of us.
Anna Louise really believed in people's power. She believed in mass movements. She believed in revolution. She was not a doctrinaire person at all. Maybe you could describe her as a small C communist, as a socialist. And she was, I think it's impossible to describe her politics without also describing something about who she was and where she came from.
Anna Louise Strong came from another century and another world. She was born in 1885 in the Midwest prairie town of Friend, Nebraska. It was America's conservative heartland. Her parents, the Reverend Sidney and Ruth Strong, were progressive middle-class reformers. Graduates of liberal Oberlin College, they opposed racism and advocated women's suffrage. In 1885, there were few Americans who shared their beliefs. They taught their children to have faith in God and in the essential brotherhood of all people. Anna Louise Strong believed in such love, with one exception.
Ever since she was a little girl, she felt that she was not liked. People liked her sister, people liked other children, but not her. And she was sort of gripped by a sense of loneliness at times.
Sometime in early childhood, I became convinced that my best bet was to be clever, that I could get attention by my brains, if in no pleasanter way.
At 10, she wrote a poem based on her Christian upbringing which foreshadowed her Marxist future.
This is the way God's mercies fall. Some more, some less, but some to all. None should wish to have more than his friend. Each should have enough to last to the end.
As a child, she enjoyed success as a writer of books for other children, and at the age of 16 graduated from high school. At 19, she obtained her bachelor's degree from Oberlin College. At 23, she became the youngest student to receive her Ph.D. from the University of Chicago. But Anna Louise Strong was not happy with the future that the academic life promised.
I had been trained by one professor after another to allow myself to be stirred. I had been trained by my religion to wait adoringly for a will that was higher. Even as a child, I had been trained to be good, to be liked, wanted, desired by parents, playmates, men, editors, had been the goal of my life. I'd been trained to expect a God and then serve him. And what a good little slave they made of me.
In 1908, the young Dr. Strong left the world of academia to enter the world in which most Americans lived and worked, and she was stirred by what she saw. These children stood at their looms 60 hours a week for less than $1 a day. Conditions such as these led Anna Louise Strong to become director of a series of child welfare exhibits, where her activities meshed well with her Christian ideals. For Anna Louise Strong, it was natural to adopt the respectable role of social worker. From her work with reformers such as Jane Addams, a new world was calling to her.
Dear Father, as I travel across the country, I am more and more impressed with the people I meet who call themselves socialists or insurgents. Like the early Christians, they instinctively rate people as worth more than property. In so doing, they are undeniably in conflict with the law.
But Strong herself was no lawbreaker. She was a young woman in search of a place for herself. She would look for such a place in New York and Chicago and even Washington, D.C., but it would be the small western city of Seattle, Washington, that ultimately became her spiritual birthplace.
Seattle was unique, and especially so for Anna Louise Strong, because it presented her with an environment which was very favorable to her career. It was a labor town, much more so than almost any other city in the United States. The industrial workers of the world, the radical labor group, were headquarters here on the West Coast, and moreover, they had a very sympathetic following in this city. She came to Seattle then looking for a fresh start, just not only for her career, but her own personal life.
And what of her personal life? Anna Louise Strong was nearly 30 years old and still unmarried.
I've become a writer because it seems ideally subordinated to marriage. It can be done in any part of the world in which my husband might take me, and can even be accomplished in odd moments at home.
She was often falling in love, or should I put it, getting a crush on someone. In this respect, she really was rather girlish.
As a young woman, I looked forward to the time I would find someone who would tell me just what to do about everything, and then I would do it. I would never have to decide for myself again.
This idea of being married to and dominated by a man, or joining a party which would tell her what to do, like a man or father figure might tell her what to do. But I said, I think that that is part of Anna Louise's fantasy life, her romantic life, because she herself could be quite a domineering person when she wanted to be. And she did get married, but who did she get married to? Not a tall, handsome, strong character who would sweep her up in his arms and take her off into the sunset on his steed. No. She got married to a very small Russian bureaucrat who had great respect for her. I don't think he ever told her to do anything.
So instead of the family life expected of her as a woman, Anna Louise Strong turned to her career. She became the second woman ever elected to the Seattle School Board, and she covered news events for both local and national newspapers. An avid mountaineer, she founded a cooperative campers movement on Mount Rainier. She could have remained among Seattle's respectable middle class, but for an event happening 25 miles north of Seattle in a mill town called Everett.
Oh, call out your fire departments, go deputize your bums, gather in your gunmen and pigeons from the slums. You may resolute till doomsday, you ill-begotten knaves. We'll still be winning free speech fights when you are in your grave.
In 1916, Jack Miller was among a group of Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world, who journeyed from Seattle to Everett to speak in support of striking shingle weavers. But the sheriff of Everett had made it a policy to use a club and a fist on any Wobbly who came into town. In protest, the Wobblies chartered a boat to travel to Everett in support of the strike. At the dock, waiting with armed deputies, was the sheriff.
And immediately he addressed those on the boat and called, "Who's your leader?" And the reply came back from the boat, "We're all leaders." He says, someone said, he said, "Well, you can't land here." And someone says, "The hell we can't." And then a single shot was fired, and followed by a volley. Now, where the single shot come from, nobody will ever know.
The Wobblies, trapped on the boat, were fired upon by 200 deputies standing behind secure fortifications. The battle lasted 10 minutes. When the gunfire stopped, the body count for the Everett massacre began. 5 Wobblies lay dead from gunshots, at least 6 more drowned. It was Jack Miller and the Wobblies, not the sheriff's men, who were arrested and charged with murder. Anna Louise Strong, covering the murder trials for the New York Evening Post, wrote not as an objective journalist, but as a partisan.
After a week, it is plain that armed lawlessness is masquerading as law in this city where the trouble occurred. It is the economic conflict between labor and capital that is on trial, and we all know who is innocent and who is guilty.
To Anna Louise Strong, the Wobblies and their supporters represented her belief in free speech and universal brotherhood, an expression of her own Christian ideals. But as would happen throughout her life, the group she both embraced and inspired held her at arm's length. She never became more than a token member of the Wobblies, always remaining an outsider. All of the Wobblies, including Jack Miller, were acquitted. But that was not the end of Anna Louise Strong's indignation.
Some folks honestly think that patriotism is lynching folks, or raiding halls to show your proper horror, and loving your country too violently to be willing to obey her laws. But it seems to me that patriotism means upholding reasoned order, and giving justice even to those whom we do not wish to be just.
But Wobbly issues were soon overshadowed by global events which to most Americans seemed more urgent and ominous. The First World War. So it was for Anna Louise Strong.
Nothing in my whole life, not even my mother's death, so shook the foundations of my soul as this profiteer's war. Our America was dead.
In 1916, millions opposed the war in Europe. But by 1917, with the U.S. entry into the war, only the Wobblies and a handful of socialists denounced the conflict and resisted the draft. Anti-war protests proved even more dangerous as Americans learned of another faraway event, the Russian Revolution. Bolshevik leaders were calling for international insurrection, inspiring both fear and reaction in America. World War I and the Russian Revolution would change the 20th century world, Anna Louise Strong and Seattle included. Strong's outspoken opposition to the war forced her recall from the school board. With the armistice, the war in Europe was over, but at home there was still no peace. In the winter of 1919, unemployment and a cut in wages caused the Seattle shipyard workers to strike. They called on all workers to do the same, to create a general strike, a massive stop work movement that would shut the city down. It was an unprecedented move, forbidden by every union charter and condemned by the American Federation of Labor. As the deadline for the strike drew near, panic sent people into the stores to hoard food and supplies. The fear that Seattle would erupt with riots induced some citizens to be deputized. The National Guard was mobilized, ready to quell the impending revolution. And across the country, editorials warned, "The Bolshevik beast has come out into the open, and it is only a step from Seattle to Petrograd." From her office in the Seattle Union Record, the city's only labor-owned paper, Anna Louise Strong issued her own call to arms.
We are undertaking the most tremendous move ever made by labor in this country, a move that will lead no one knows where. We do not need hysteria. We do not need fear. We need the iron march of labor, for labor will feed the people, care for the babies and the sick, and preserve order. Not the withdrawal of labor power, but the power of the workers to manage will win this strike.
Her editorial, it seems to me, sums up the spirit of that strike. They didn't know what they were doing, is the way I would interpret this, or where they were going. But it sounds ominous. It's got a kind of romantic touch to it, and it captivates people even now. And their eyes get big when they think about that editorial.
It was the first general strike in U.S. history. The wealthy, fearing revolution, fled to hotels in Portland. The middle class, fearing violence, stayed locked in their homes. Seattle functioned as a worker-run city, inspiring Strong to write,
If by revolution is meant violent, forcible taking of property, killing of men, surely none of our workers dreamed of such action. But if you mean that a great change is coming over the face of the earth, which will transform our methods of carrying out industry, then we do believe in such a great change, and our general strike was one step towards it.
After only 3 days, the strike collapsed. But for Anna Louise Strong, it was not the end, but the beginning.
Anna Louise Strong, by this editorial No One Knows Where and the subsequent Seattle General Strike, made a name for herself as a radical calling for revolution. It struck fear in the hearts of a number of people, but it also aroused a great deal of hope among radical groups, both in this country and around the world. She therefore never lost this one incident from her own background, and she was proud of it. She would always say to herself in coming years, if she was ever tired or felt she was losing her drive, to be back to the Seattle General Strike days when that was really the most important thing that was going on in the world.
With the end of the strike, Seattle's labor movement was left beaten and divided. A demoralized Anna Louise Strong again struggled to find a place for herself. This time, the answer came from an old friend, the journalist Lincoln Steffens. Steffens, returning from a trip to the Soviet Union, told her, "I have seen the future, and it works." In 1921, Anna Louise Strong left for the Soviet Union. She joined a generation of Americans searching for a new world. Artists and political exiles such as John Reed and Louise Bryant, Isadora Duncan, and wobbly Big Bill Haywood. Unlike the others, Strong would be cast out, but she would keep seeking a home for herself in a world compatible with her ideals.
It's not that there weren't many with good educations and good social standing who got fascinated with the Russian Revolution, but not very many stayed with it. I mean, there's a great remark of Lenin: when the locomotive of history goes around a sharp turn, only the strong stay on. Well, a lot of sharp turns, and she managed to stay on right up until the time that she's thrown out of Russia.
In the decades that followed, Anna Louise Strong would crisscross the globe. She lived for nearly 30 years in Russia, editing the Moscow Daily News and corresponding regularly with everyone from Henry Ford to Eleanor Roosevelt. In 1958, she moved to China, where for over 10 years, her letter from China was translated into 6 languages and circulated throughout the world. She supported revolutionary movements, meeting with leaders such as Ho Chi Minh and Che Guevara. But while she enjoyed her international reputation, she could not ignore her American heritage.
She was very excited about what was happening in the United States. Of course, this was during the time when we were right in the middle of the war in Vietnam, of course, and she was very excited and terribly, terribly pleased about the anti-war movement that was developing in the United States. And she was very interested in all the issues that were coming up at that time, not just the anti-war question, but also what was happening among blacks. She was very interested in the environmentalist movement also. Very early, she latched onto that and was very excited about it. And she was just, she said many times that from her own experience in the United States, in Seattle, that she was convinced that this germ of good rebellion existed in the American people, and she was very, very happy to see it, and she kept up with it very, very carefully.
The inspiration that I got from Anna Louise came very directly when I was in prison for the first time in 1949 in China. Anna Louise had been arrested by Stalin in Moscow and declared an American spy and expelled from the Soviet Union, and the Russians demanded that I be arrested in China, which was done. And it was an awful shock to me, and I really had a problem just facing the situation and figuring it out. And one night while the grilling was going on in the daytime, one night I went to sleep and I dreamed. I saw a woman, a large-built, rather stately-looking woman with white hair, who was sitting on a little stool like the stool of the accused that I sat on every day to be grilled. And her arms were raised and she was shouting, obviously, at her tormentors. She was saying, don't you see what a terrible thing this is that you're doing? Don't you see that you are doing what I have been denying for years to people in America that you do? It's outrageous, it's terrible. And I woke up and I realized that the woman in the dream was Anna Louise Strong. And I thought to myself, that's how Anna Louise would handle it.
She is a part of history. She is a part of the women's liberation movement. She went into journalism and played an important part, because so far as I can remember, there was no other woman journalist in China, or that I can remember on the world scene, doing what she did, right along there with the men.
Anna Louise Strong was a woman ahead of her time. Always an outsider, she was a witness to some of the most important events of the last 75 years. And her special view of those events was heard throughout the world.
I'm reporter enough to know that there is no absolute truth. Truth is for each of us, our picture of the world. When I say I want to tell the truth, I mean I want to paint my picture.
Anna Louise Strong died in 1970 at the age of 84. She was buried in a cemetery for revolutionary martyrs just outside Peking. In the story of her life, she left a legacy of social conscience and personal commitment.